2019 Writing in the Disciplines panel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Pisano. I'm the Writing Program Coordinator. And every semester for the past 4 years, we've invited faculty from across campus to speak with first-year students about what writing looks like in their disciplines. This semester, I'm excited to introduce Evan Kuzo from Education, Marcus Harvey from Religious Studies, Melissa Hemmeline from Psychology, and Linnea Litton in Engineering. I didn't know what order they would sit in, so that is not the right order. I apologize. While writing studies is a distinct field with its own disciplinary conventions and body of research, the skills that you're learning in Lang 120 are skills that you'll be able to transfer and apply into other classes that you're taking as well. Too often we think about English class as disconnected from our majors and our intended course of study. So this panel is just one of the ways that first-year writing instructors are trying to help you make those connections between what we're doing in class and what you're going to be doing in other classes and in your majors. As you listen to the faculty panelists, I invite you to consider what you're learning in Lang 120 and how those skills and ideas might transfer into other various disciplines. I've asked that each of the panelists speak briefly with you about their writing in their disciplines, and then we'll use the remaining amount of time to respond to your questions. To save time, I'll ask that each panelist introduce themselves. As you listen, consider what questions you have for the presenters. You might want to jot them down so that you can remember them when it's time for question and answer. We'll end promptly at 1, so please try to stay for the entire event if you can. If you have to leave for another obligation, try to exit really quietly. And now I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Hello. I suppose I'll start. My name is Evan Kuzo. I'm in the Education Department. So my main role here is training math and science teachers. So if any of you think you want to be math or science teachers, I'm your guy. My research background is as an atmospheric and environmental scientist. I study and teach classes on air pollution and climate change. So most of the writing that I've done is through the lens of a natural scientist. So writing journal articles and really writing to inform and writing to describe the kinds of research that I've done. As I've shifted more into the social sciences in the education department, I've come to see writing in a broader context of a form of communication that is supposed to educate, that is supposed to teach something. So writing isn't just about a word count or even structure. It really should be designed to teach somebody something. And so there are right ways and wrong ways of communicating, and there are more effective and less effective ways of communicating. And so when I think about writing broadly, that's the context for which I think of it.
I'm Melissa Hemmeline. I'm in the psychology department, and I hold a variety of other roles on campus currently. In terms of writing in psychology, and let me pause and see, how many of you have thought about maybe an interest in psychology or a possible major? It is one of the larger majors on campus, so okay, great. So let me say a little bit about what writing in psychology would look like here. For starting at the sophomore level or 200 level classes, I would say that there's roughly 3 types of writing projects that you might be asked to do. The first would be more of a traditional lab report, so similar to what Dr. Kuzo mentioned, this would be description of a lab experience or a research experience, and that tends to be written in a pretty structured, formulaic manner with intro, method, results, discussion, and then that type of writing would potentially grow into upper level electives. It might become individual research, and then if you chose to get involved in the undergraduate research program, that's the kind of writing that would be your final paper, maybe as a senior. A second type of writing that you would experience in psychology classes, I would just put in the category of reflection and reaction papers. So a professor might ask you to read an article and then, for example, talk about maybe a summary of the argument that the author had, let's say, on nature versus nurture of some attribute like aggression. And then you might be asked to apply that to examples in your own life. A great thing about writing in psychology is we can apply pretty much anything to examples in our own life. So you get to do a lot of that. And then I would say a third category is kind of an all-encompassing other category. So there might be things like case studies where you are asked to read an anecdote about an individual and then based on what you're learning in the class, figure out what might be their likely psychological diagnosis or how a psychologist might choose to treat that person. Another kind of other experience might be something more digital. So although we're talking about writing projects, there's also digital communication that we're trying to increase students' awareness of. So for example, there was a class last year where all the students did infographics it was a class in adolescence, and so they learned about the problems of adolescence and then partnered with a middle school to produce infographics for them to put in the hallway describing a particular type of problem that adolescents experience and some resources for how to deal with that. Another type of digital project might be producing a video clip. I teach a class in helping skills, and as a final project, I ask students to get into pairs and write up a scenario for themselves, but then in the video demonstrate their competence in being able to respond to somebody with a problem using specific helping skills. Now, you might not think of that as a writing project, but it's absolutely a communication project, and it takes some pretty high-level skills to really dream up a creative scenario and then figure out how you might be able to respond and usually write some notes and then perform that for an audience. And then we also try to do in our senior seminars some applied projects that might be more relevant to workplace situations. So sometimes in our advanced seminars, people might be asked to do sort of a research project proposal that, say you went to work in a nonprofit and you were trying to get funds for that nonprofit, you would perhaps be submitting some proposals to various organizations on trying to secure grant funds. So we might give students some practice in an opportunity like that. I teach a senior seminar where I ask students to do resumes. Again, not something you might think of as a writing project, but actually writing a resume, I think, is one of the most challenging writing projects that there is. So that's a good sort of career relevant writing project that you might be asked to do. Okay, I've probably said enough.
Hi everyone, my name is Linnea Linton and I am the Associate Director of the Engineering Department. And it's funny that you mentioned resumes. I am currently grading the resumes from my E101 class, Intro to Engineering. So those of y'all who are waiting on it, I'm working on it. Engineering is an interesting place to talk about writing because people don't automatically think of the word writing when I say engineering. But at the same time, so I'm a structural engineer, which means that I work with structures. I work with buildings, either new construction, investigations on existing structures, that kind of thing. And so the engineering program here, if you stay all 4 years, is a mechatronics program, which is more focused on mechanical and electrical combined with computer science. But the ideas are sort of similar. So in my line of work specifically, when I was in industry, I would find myself writing a lot of reports. And it depended on who those reports were aimed at as to how technical they got, of course. So I took my thesis, which was a good inch and some odd thick, and turned it into a 5-page journal paper. And that was aimed very much at an engineering audience, so I didn't have to explain, for instance, what concrete was, what non-destructive testing was, all the details. They already knew that background, so I could just get straight to the nitty-gritty and talk about the results of my thesis. On the other hand, when I had my own company and I would do investigations on existing structures, the people who were the audience for those reports or papers would be a homeowner who might have zero technical background. And so I would have to remember to explain that when I say the initials CMU, that means concrete masonry unit, which also means cinder block. But I'm going to shorten it to CMU because that's the correct technical engineering term for it, right? But if I just say CMU to engineer, they know that. But to a non-engineer, they're like, what? And nobody wants to feel that way when you're writing. So there's a lot of clarity that's required in engineering writing. And again, depending on who your aimed source is. If you go to the research side, of course, there will be similar things like a lab report or results of your research, which can get extraordinarily technical, which is fun to do sometimes and also mind-numbingly dull to read at times, depending on whether or not you're interested in what they're talking about. But then it's also a really fun experience in writing to explain to non-engineers why that crack over there, that's not really there, is a really interesting crack to me as an engineer. Or why, if you drive across a bridge and you notice that, we just talked about this in E101 last night, if you notice that the beams are actually bent upward, why? And there's a very good engineering reason for that. But so not only do engineers need to be able to write well, but at the same time, and I think tied very closely to that, they need to be able to speak well, to get their ideas across. Now, if a mechatronics engineer designs a part and they cannot communicate, first of all, what the point is for that part, second of all, how to make that part, and third of all, what's required from other parts to make that part work in its most efficient way, then there's no point, right? So being able to communicate well in written form, in technical form, but also in a meeting to express what you need information-wise, what you're hoping to get, to ask and listen to what other people need, that to me ties in very closely with writing. How's that? Ooh, deep breath. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Dr. Marcus Harvey. I'm in the Department of Religious Studies, and that means that I'm involved in the academic study of religion. I'm not a preacher, I'm not a pastor, none of that. A lot of people assume that that's what religious studies people do. That is not what we do. So let's be clear about that. My area of research focuses primarily on African indigenous religious systems, and I approach that work as a phenomenologist of religion, which is a big fancy sounding word. But what that means basically is that I'm interested in understanding these religious systems from the perspective of practitioners themselves, right, rather than imposing a ready-made framework of study onto them. My focus is on allowing the religious data that I study to teach me and inform the conclusions that I make about them. My field is very interdisciplinary, right? So what that means is that you will find anthropologists of religion, historians of religion, psychologists of religion, etc. And what that means as far as writing is concerned is that it's very possible that, for instance, me in my particular area of phenomenology of religion may be writing an article or a book chapter or a book that's going to be read by maybe a psychologist of religion. And so the question of audience is really a big question in my field. And the goal then is to really produce writing that is of course, academically sound and technical, but also capable of entering into conversation with other religion scholars working from other disciplinary perspectives. And that's a tall order, but I think that is what makes religious studies writing in many ways distinctive. And I'll just share one last thing before I shut up here, to sort of underscore the importance of the academic study of religion. So about 9 years ago, there was an earthquake in Haiti. Some of you may have heard about this. It was devastating. I can't recall what the actual ranking of it was. It was pretty devastating. And not long after the earthquake occurred, a very prominent conservative voice in this country, Pat Robertson, jumped on TV on his show, The 700 Club, and offered an interpretation for why the Haitian earthquake occurred. And he was very clear. He said, and you can find this on YouTube, this is not, So he says, a long time ago, something happened in Haiti. Some people got together and made a pact with the devil. And they said, devil, if you will, and he's referring here to enslaved Africans in Haiti. And he said, devil, if you will free us from French slavery, we will serve you forever, Pat Robertson said. And he said that the devil said, well, African Haitians, you have a deal. Now, what Robertson was referring to without explicitly naming it was the Haitian Revolution of 1791, which was galvanized or launched by a Haitian voodoo ceremony at a place called Bois Caïman, wherein very powerful, very important voodoo deities were invoked in order to provide the energy for this 13-year revolution, which became the only successful slave revolution in the history of the Atlantic world, and resulted in the erection of Haiti as a free, independent African nation, right? But were it not for religion scholars, we would have no other interpretation of Haitian voodoo, apart from what Pat Robertson threw at us in 2010. And so writing in my field becomes all the more important because of people like Pat Robertson and the legacy that he represents. So I think I'll stop there and let it go.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
So now we'll open it up to questions. Any questions for any of the panelists?
Keep your pants.
Yeah.
How many of you actually enjoy writing?
What a good question.
I do. I actually do. As an engineer, I'm crazy. I like writing.
Depends on where in the process. Right? So I'm about to start a manuscript. I've done some of the research, and I have a blank page, and that's terrifying, and it's awful, because the first few thousand words I write are going to be garbage, and I'm going to have to throw them out. But once I have a draft, the editing process, or self-editing process, where you're moving blocks of text around and trying to solve this puzzle, how can I communicate in this very linear way, right? Left to right, top to bottom. How can I communicate all the thoughts and interconnections that I see in the data? That part is so fun, but it takes a while to get there. So right now I'm not enjoying it, but in about a month it'll be fun.
I like to say I enjoy having written, but I think if your question is a little bit about writer's block kinds of experiences, what's always helped me is doing a little bit at a time. I'm somebody that, especially when I'm trying to get started, or especially when I have a deadline coming up, I do a lot better if I do 30 minutes a day or 60 minutes a day. Sometimes before I adopted this method, I used to say, oh, I can't write unless I have like a whole day. So it would take months to get to that whole day, and then I would spend a lot of that day trying to remember what is it that I'm supposed to be writing, and then that would have me reading all sorts of things, and I would manage to fritter away time, and it would be 9 o'clock on that day, and I still wouldn't have done much. So I have learned that doing a little bit every day, and someone once told me stopping mid-sentence is ideal, because then when you start up the next day, you have a place to start, like, oh, I can finish that sentence, I can do that, and then that keeps you going. So that's helped me a lot more enjoy writing. I definitely enjoy it in short bursts, but those full days, I'm not someone who can do it that way.
Yeah, I would echo much of what has been said. I do have a love for writing, but what I tell all of my students is that writing is a discipline that requires you to suffer. I don't want to dress this up. I mean, writing is a form of suffering that can, I think, result in profound levels of growth intellectually and personally. So I love writing, but at the same time, I respect what it requires of me. And what it requires is quite a bit. And I think that you all will discover that in short order.
One of the things I've found helpful, actually, when I get very stuck, is if I have a large report to write or a large journal article, something like that, I just start with a complete brain dump. Here are all the basic points I need to remember to cover. And then clearly that's going to be maybe 3 lines, maybe a page and a half, depending on the size of what I'm doing. But then at least I don't have to necessarily worry, oh, I haven't forgotten to talk about X. And then even while I'll be officially writing, sometimes I'll come back in and be like, oh, I have to remember to add that. And so I'm taking away from that list, but hopefully at the end of whatever I've done, that list is gone and everything has been incorporated.
Within each one of your respective fields, what would happen if you didn't have the writing skills to communicate what you're trying to get across? Like, what would the repercussions be? Like, yeah.
Well, in my field, you would not get a PhD, for number one. As I'm sure it's probably true in all of our fields, because the PhD degree requires you to produce a book-length original study, right? Mine was about 450 pages long total. And that was a very painful, violent process. But it was writing. It was relentless writing, relentless research, relentless writing. And I think that exercise it's intended to prove, number one, that you're a proficient researcher and that you're capable of articulating your research, kind of going to some of the earlier points, in intelligible, coherent ways that other audiences can make sense of. If you can't do that, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that, okay, maybe this isn't the field for you. But I think that given the way that higher education has been constructed in our society, writing is really considered to be a core skill. And if you lack that skill, I think you're gonna have a hard way to go. Yeah.
And I would just say that I agree with everything Marcus has said, especially the pain. But I also want to emphasize that writing is really developmental, and you can improve in your writing and your facility and your comfort with writing throughout your life. So I think about the process for me of writing a journal article. At this time in my life, I bet it takes 10% of the time that it took me when I was a graduate student to do the very same thing, which says, writing skills just keep developing. And of course, I do that sort of professional writing that I still do today of writing a journal article. That is a fairly repetitive skill, and so you get increasingly comfortable and you master it to some extent. So I think if somebody has the motivation to be, say, a psychologist, and you say, I struggle with writing, maybe I can't be a psychologist, I would say, no, you can learn how to write. If you want to be a psychologist, you'll figure it out. And we have a ton of resources on our campus, the Writing Center, but also your faculty, and most people will give you opportunities to do drafts of writing projects so you can learn from repeated practice. I think it's just like any other skill, you really have to practice at it a lot. So yeah, it would definitely impede your ability probably to do any of our jobs if you said, nah, I don't want to learn how to write. But it would probably impede your ability in a lot of areas if you had that sort of mentality of, I don't want to learn how to do X, right? So.
And so in addition to those transactional consequences of you can't do your job, you can't get your job, you can't be promoted in your line of work, and the personal consequences of growth and learning how to structure an argument or structure a claim. In the sciences specifically, even if you aren't worried about the consequences to yourself or to your career, there's a consequence to the field. It doesn't do any good to have hundreds of scientists studying a question that's already been answered or going down a dead end that has been confirmed to be a dead end. So it's through writing that science advances. It's how we tell each other what we've done, what worked, what assumptions we've made, so scientists can come after us, revisit those assumptions, try the experiment under different conditions, or ask a slightly different question. And that's what science is about, is progressing forward. And without writing, it can't progress.
So I am a licensed professional engineer. I had to take 2 big, giant, scary tests. I can get a PhD in engineering, but in the world of practicing engineers, a PE is sort of the equivalent of a PhD. So if I am not clear in a report, if I say something that is wrong to the point of being dangerous, I can lose my license, which means that I no longer am able to practice engineering. End of story, done, goodbye, good luck. At the same time, there have been cases where an engineer was not clear about, for instance, what strength of concrete needed to be used, what specific type of metal needed to be used, and people can die. I'm not saying that to be scary or anything, but the one thing that just jumped into my brain was there was a spaceship where the units were like metric but actually imperial or vice versa on the length of a screw, and that penetrated a heat shield and the spaceship exploded. So there can be some extremely dire consequences in engineering if you're not a clear communicator. But at the same time, it's also important that it's not all hellfire and brimstone. Not everybody's going to die just because I used the wrong word. So it's also part of helping people understand what's going on in a very technical field in a way that isn't very technical but doesn't talk down to people at the same time, if that helps. Because when I would write a report and say, this crack in your basement is caused by this reason, you don't need to worry about it, or we need to keep an eye on it, or you need to get out and we're going to replace your foundation and you cannot stay here. I needed to be very clear about which level we're at that, because it has ramifications for life and safety issues. Yeah.
I would just add quickly to Melissa's point. In my experience, something that has really helped me grow as a writer has been reading. Voraciously. And there's this really interesting kind of mysterious process that happens wherein the more you read, the more carefully you read, your writing gradually begins to improve. I can't really explain that psychologically, but something is happening there. So
osmosis?
Yeah, something like that. It's very interesting. But yeah, so I would strongly encourage you all to commit yourself to being disciplined readers. And so doing your writing is I think almost guaranteed to improve over time. Yeah. So.
Just real quickly, when I think about ramifications, Professor Harvey, I also think about your story about responding. You need to be able to write to respond to current events,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And make sure that all perspectives are heard.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of ramifications.
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah,
Yeah,
very good point.
yeah. Other questions?
Here on the left or right, whatever side you're looking at.
Like in your discipline, when you're writing, I guess this for you all individually, I guess, but how many drafts do you tend to go through? Like, what does your editing process look like?
Lots.
Like when do you decide when you've had enough, or when to stop?
When it's accepted for publication. So a couple years ago, I was writing this is just one example. I was writing a paper with some researchers at Chapel Hill. I think the version we submitted was version 23 or 24. So that's how many times we had circulated the manuscript among the authors. So a lot.
Yeah, I would say, that's a good question. I would say, I think along that line, it's helpful to think of writing as a corporate kind of thing. And by that, what I mean is, of course, you'll sit by yourself, maybe in a carrel somewhere or in your room, and you'll hammer out a draft. But then you invite others to help you refine that draft. And that's where writing becomes a corporate exercise. And it's in that sort of corporate revisional stage that you produce these multiple drafts. I'll share a quick funny story. So when I was doing my dissertation, it took me forever to finish the first chapter, which is about maybe 40 pages or so. And the day that I finished it, my brain, and I was exhausted, my brain said, look, man, this is good to go. Send it into your committee. It's fine. You're fine. You're fine. And so I trusted my brain, and I sent it in. And about 4 or 5 days later, I get and I'm thinking that, man, this thing is almost pristine. I have really nailed this. But when I get it back from my committee, this was 6 other people who had laid eyes on this thing. I mean, there was a whole universe of issues that I had missed because I had insisted, I think wrongly, on not allowing that chapter to be a corporate kind of thing. Had I done that, I think I would have produced a much stronger, or I would have submitted a much stronger draft initially. So, yeah, I would just offer that.
My process with writing is, again, because I do those short bursts, I tend to start the next day, and maybe I don't allow myself to go back to the beginning because then I might never get any farther. But so if I'm on page 2 when I stop, I'll start on page 2 the next day. I'll read that. I'll allow myself to revise the paragraphs above, and then I'll keep going. Then I stop again, and the next day do a little bit more with a little revision. So I am revising all the way through. Then when I finish, I do one day, one session kind of revision of everything, and then I make sure to share it with friends. So I think having people, readers you trust, to say, please give me feedback, not people who will just say, oh, that's wonderful, yeah, terrific, but people that will really dig deep into it and ask you questions. That's really helpful. And I will say that even when I'm writing an email, now if it's late at night, I don't always follow this, but I try not to let myself send a first draft of anything, because I especially with email, actually, because it could be circulated widely, I actually have a little mantra of, how would this look on the front page of the Asheville Citizen-Times before I hit send? And if I think it would completely humiliate me, then I, don't send, right? So even then I will, I have tried to train myself, always go back and reread an email. So I think always you're going to do a few drafts. You don't want to be the person that, 23 sounds horrible to me. I'm so sorry. But, and I think there can be a problem on the other end, right? That you just never let anything go because you get too obsessive about it, and you won't want to go in that extreme. So somewhere between 2 and 23 is probably good.
Well, and for me, it depends what I'm writing. Because if it's a report that is basically the same thing that I've written 37 other times, I can cut and paste. I can change a few things. I can make sure that I edit it. But the one thing that I absolutely never did was PDF and send it right away. Exactly like you're saying. I always sat on it for absolute minimum 2 hours. Walked away, did something completely unrelated, came back to it, read it again and said, I totally put the wrong name in there, which matters. If it's something brand new to me, I follow kind of my own weird mix of what everyone else has said, bits and starts, that kind of thing. But I wholeheartedly agree with asking someone else to review it. When my husband writes marketing materials or a paper for his work, no matter what he's doing, I don't even understand necessarily what the exact meat behind it is, but I am being his uninformed consumer of his product. And so I'll read through it and say, "Hun, you need a comma here," which is our ongoing battle. We have this constant battle about where commas go in our house. That's fine. But I'll make sure to say, this isn't, I don't know what you mean here, or what exactly is that acronym, and that kind of thing. And it helps him look at it with fresh eyes and remember, oh yeah, not everybody knows what CMU is, that kind of thing. So yeah.
And two quick things on the revision process. When you have a completed draft and you're going through the revisions, typically the rule of thumb is you're looking to make it shorter. You're looking to remove words or clauses or say things more clearly. The second thing is when you have someone else look at it, if they don't understand something, that's your fault as the writer. Their responsibility isn't to understand. Your responsibility is to explain. So that can be hard because if you get very attached to a piece of your writing, you can feel like you're being attacked. But you can't dismiss what somebody says about your writing, especially if it comes to the clarity of the writing. If you find that you have to explain out loud in words what you meant, then you didn't put what you meant in writing. So those are just two things I would say about revising and editing.
That's a very good point. I think there was another question in the middle somewhere. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, do you guys have any tips for a really slow reader and writer, especially when it comes to looking over really in-depth research papers, and how to go about that in a way that allows me to process it better? Does that make sense?
I would say that I have had that question from so many students, and a lot of times what people understand as being very slow is what I think is really normal, because I think we get so used to reading on the fly. Most of what you read on your phones or is going to be short bites, but to read, say, a journal article and to read it well takes a long time. And I think a lot of times students, especially say when they get to upper level classes and maybe we're asking them to dig into primary sources, which are much denser, students will come and say, yeah, I don't have the time to do this. And I'll be like, well, how much time did you really spend? Well, 30 minutes on this journal article. And I'm like, even if it's a 10-page journal article, it might take 2 hours to read to really understand if you're really having to dig into each piece. And I think the same thing with writing. I have students that will sometimes say to me, oh my gosh, it took me a whole hour to write this page. And I think, that's first draft, that sounds about right to me. I mean, so I don't know if you would still, with that in mind, consider it slow, but I I would say you're probably doing your job if you're going slow.
Yeah. One specific strategy that I use and teach is with journal articles or a piece of complex text. In the sciences anyway, there's usually not more than one main idea in a paragraph. So read, paraphrase each paragraph in a sentence, and then you have a 13 or 14 sentence summary of the paper. Do that in reverse and you've written a journal article. What is the one thing you want to say in this paragraph, followed by the next thing and the next thing, and then you flesh out the details and you cite your references or provide the quantitative information.
Yeah, I mean, I would just basically echo what has been said. I do something very similar, Evan, with my students, especially first-year students. What I would add to that, though, it's also helpful to, when you're reading, to underline in the text itself, if you can, terms that are repeated, because often those terms clue you in as to what the author is up to, why he or she or they are making this particular linguistic choice, and how these terms relate to the central argument, right? So, and also I would just say that taking notes as you read, I mean, I think this is a kind of a laborious process, of course, but it's a way of getting to know a piece of reading intimately, right? And that requires time and intellectual patience. And so I don't know that being able, that reading a particular text quickly is a virtue at all. I mean, I'm not sure how much can be gained from that. So I would just encourage you to be clear in your own thinking as to how you're attacking a particular reading assignment. What note-taking structure are you adopting, and how well is it serving you, right? I'll focus on that rather than, oh, I'm a slow reader or a slow writer.
I have the opposite problem, that I'm way too fast of a reader and I miss details. And so I end up having to go back and read things 2 or 3 times just to make sure that I didn't miss the main point. And it's frustrating because my eyes just really go fast. It does have the benefit if I'm reading like a murder mystery book that I don't remember who did it, so I can read the book again. But at the same time, that's not useful in an academic setting.
I want to ask a follow-up to this question. So you talked about the difficulties, the suffering, right, of the writing and the processes and all that time that it takes to do the reading and the writing. And you talked about some of the consequences if it doesn't come home, right, which are external motivators. But I wonder, what is it that motivates you intrinsically, internally? Where do you find the motivation to be willing to undertake this level of work and effort and discipline and suffering?
To me, it's a puzzle. Like, there are pieces that fit together, and there is a right way to fit them together. There is a best way to structure your writing. And I enjoy that process once I know what it is I want to say. That's looking at writing as a whole, or looking at a piece of writing as a whole. Within a sentence, constructing a well-crafted sentence is fun, right? It's little pieces, it's understanding grammar, and so I do a lot of computer programming, and you have to be very clear in what you tell the computer to do because it doesn't understand context. And so I've been able to translate that into writing for humans, but it's fun, right? Like, should a comma go here? Would a semicolon be better? Should this clause go to the front of the sentence? Am I being clear which noun is being described by this adjective? Like, those questions to me make writing fun.
So that is such a good question. I'm sitting here reflecting on it. With regard to reading, so for me, I love fiction reading, and that is just pure entertainment. And so it goes incredibly quickly, and I never worry about how much time it takes because I'm just doing it for the pure enjoyment of it, right? Nonfiction or, professional writing is a whole different ballgame for me. And And sometimes I have to remind myself, no, you do have to struggle a little bit. It's not the same process for me. Now, my husband reads tons of nonfiction for fun. I don't do it for fun exactly. And some of the faculty in the room will probably find this ironic because one of my other hats is that I lead a lot of what are called learning circles for faculty on our campus, where faculty will come together and read a book about teaching or a current issue and think about how it can be applied to teaching. And these are always nonfiction. Well, not always, but mostly nonfiction materials. And inevitably, when I'm preparing for a learning circle, no matter how much I love the author's ideas, I find myself flipping to the back of the reading assignment and saying, how many more pages? Okay, not going to watch Netflix tonight. And it just never goes away. So I know in the end, I want to have read that because I want to go talk about this book with people, and I don't want to be the idiot in the room who didn't do my work, so that holds me accountable. But in the moment, it's just not nearly as enjoyable as the process of reading fiction for me. With regard to writing, I would say that it's a very similar thing. If I'm writing for myself, I still do some journaling occasionally, or some reflective writing. I find that totally fun and engaging and entertaining in the moment. Professional writing, it is more drudgery. And I think that my motivation comes from I'm just somebody who has a pretty high level of frustration tolerance. I've been a lifelong runner. I've run marathons. It's a lot like marathon running, not really fun during it sometimes, but boy, do you feel great when you finish. So I think that's maybe a personality variable that helps.
Yeah, I would say, so there's a book that was published in the 1970s by a Ugandan writer named Okot Bitek, and it's entitled African Religions in Western Scholarship. It's a short book. But in the book, he makes a very compelling case for why and how written scholarship on African cultural traditions dating back to at least, say, the 17th century, has essentially misrepresented African cultural traditions in ways that even modern day African communities are having to respond to and correct. And again, just to underscore the point, writing is implicated in that misrepresentational process, right, which was a colonizing, imperialistic process. And so for me, in terms of the question of what motivates me on the internal level, a desire to participate as an African-descended person in this process of rewriting Africa, rewriting the story of how Africans understand their own traditions, countering this very violent legacy of anti-African writing, which in many ways defines, unfortunately, the Euro-Western intellectual tradition on the humanities side. And so for me, there's much at stake historically, culturally, and even personally in the work of academic writing in my field. And that for me is a motivation that continues to be nourishing. Yeah.
That's a really hard question for me for some reason, mostly because I don't write personally. I have other kinds of hobbies, and so pretty much every time I write, it's because somebody has told me I have to, which is very external. But at the same time, for an internal reason, I do have a bit of perfectionism going on, like a lot of engineers do. I want it to be right, because in engineering, there are lots of ways to be right, but there's definitely a wrong as well. And we want to make sure that we keep on the right side of right. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? everyone for this wonderful panel today. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, of course, students and faculty for being here. Students, if you have not signed in on one of those sign-in sheets, please make sure to do that so that your faculty, your instructors know that you were here. Thank you so much.